January 15th, 1947. A woman is walking with her young daughter down a quiet street in Los Angeles, and she spots something in the weeds of an empty lot. She thinks it's a broken store mannequin, pale, split in two pieces, just lying there in the grass. She's wrong. It's a 22-year-old woman named Elizabeth Short, and what happened to her would become the most famous unsolved case in American history, with a media circus, a killer who mailed letters to the press, and at least 3 suspects who all fit disturbingly well. This is the Black Dahlia. So who was Elizabeth? Before she was a headline, she was just a kid from Massachusetts with movie star dreams. Elizabeth grew up outside Boston. Her dad lost everything in the 1929 crash, and not long after, he vanished, his car found abandoned near a bridge. Everyone assumed the worst. Turns out he hadn't. He'd just started a completely new life across the country and didn't tell his family for over a decade. Elizabeth moved around a lot as a young woman, Florida, back to Massachusetts, eventually California, chasing the same thing a lot of young women were chasing in the 1940s, Hollywood. She never landed a real acting role. She waited tables, she dated, she bounced between apartments and boarding houses, borrowing money, staying with near strangers when she was short on rent. People who knew her described her as strikingly pretty, jet black hair, pale skin, always dressed sharp, usually in black. That look is exactly why, after her death, the newspapers would give her the nickname that outlived her real name entirely. That morning in January, in the Leimert Park neighborhood, Elizabeth's body is found in that vacant lot, and it's staged, deliberately posed, not just left there. Her body had been cut cleanly in two at the waist. Investigators immediately noticed something specific. The cuts are precise, clean, not hacked or frantic. Whoever did this either had real surgical or anatomical knowledge or spent a long time making sure it looked that way. There's no blood at the scene, none, which tells detectives immediately this isn't where it happened. Her body had been moved there, already cleaned and arranged. Here's where this case gets genuinely strange, because the press doesn't just cover it, they become part of it. The Los Angeles newspapers at the time were locked in a brutal circulation war, and this story is a goldmine. They start inventing details. Short's plain black work suit becomes, in print, a tight skirt and sheer blouse. She's rebranded from a waitress with unpaid rent to a supposed nightclub temptress who prowled Hollywood Boulevard. None of that was really true, but it sold papers, and it's a big reason the Black Dahlia myth exploded the way it did. Then, on January 23rd, just over a week after the body's found, someone calls the editor of one of the papers, says he's worried the story is losing steam, offers to mail over some of Short's belongings to keep interest alive. The next day, an envelope arrives. Inside, Elizabeth's birth certificate, business cards, photos, and her address book with one name embossed right on the cover. Within hours, LAPD has hundreds of officers on this. Newspaper reporters are practically racing detectives to the scene. And because of how the body was found, the story doesn't stay local for long. It goes national almost overnight.
The suspects. That name belonged to a late nightclub owner Elizabeth had stayed with. He becomes an early suspect, questioned repeatedly, but investigators never find anything solid enough to charge him. Detectives end up contacting around 75 men listed in that same address book. Most barely knew her. Then there's a second name that keeps coming up over the decades, a Los Angeles doctor with a reputation for a wild, secretive lifestyle. Years after the case goes cold, his own son, who grew up to become a homicide detective himself, becomes convinced his father did it. He points to a wiretapped phone call from that same year, where his father is recorded saying something chillingly vague about how easy it would be to get away with something, supposing he did. It's disturbing, it's suggestive. It is not, by itself, proof. A third name, a man who used to work as a mortuary assistant. What makes him stand out isn't a confession, it's that when police talk to him, he knows specific details about the crime scene that were never released to the public. Exactly the kind of detail that either makes someone look very guilty or means they picked it up secondhand somewhere. He's interrogated for days, never charged. And then there's the confessions, over 60 of them, from total strangers, men and women both, all claiming to be the one who did it. Every single one turns out to be false.
Some historians think a chunk of these might have come from the same person just trying to mess with police over and over. Why it's never been solved. So with 3 strong suspects, a mailed package, and a media frenzy, why does this case just die? A few reasons. LAPD in the 1940s wasn't exactly a model of clean, careful evidence handling. Records from this era have gaps, some were reportedly lost or mishandled outright. Combine that with a suspect list bloated by decades of amateur theories, copycat confessors, and journalists chasing their own angles, and you get a case that's been picked apart by so many competing narratives that separating fact from myth is almost impossible now. No DNA, no modern forensics existed yet. And the person most likely to know the truth, whoever wrote that letter, whoever sent the envelope, never came forward again. Nearly 80 years later, it's still officially open, still unsolved.
And there is a guy named Steve Hodel, spent years working homicide for the LAPD, closing hundreds of cases. Solid, experienced, the kind of guy juries believed. After his father, Dr. George Hodel, passes away in 1999, Steve is going through his dad's old belongings and finds a photo album. Inside, pictures of a woman he doesn't recognize. Something about her face nags at him. Eventually, he becomes convinced it's Elizabeth Short. That single moment sends him down a rabbit hole that lasts the rest of his life, because his father, it turns out, wasn't just some random name. Dr. George Hodel had actually been one of the original suspects investigators looked at back in 1947. So who was Dr. George Hodel? George Hodel was not a boring man. Trained as a doctor, once a concert-level pianist, running in LA's bohemian art and film circles, friends with photographers, poets, even a young Man Ray. He also had a documented dark side. In 1949, he was arrested and tried for allegedly assaulting his own teenage daughter. He was acquitted at trial, but the accusation and the trial itself is part of the public record. During that same period, LA County investigators had actually bugged his house, a live wiretap running for weeks, trying to catch him saying something incriminating about a different matter entirely. They caught something, just not what they expected. On that recording, at one point, George Hodel is overheard saying a line about how they could never link him to it, something along the lines of supposing he'd been the one, how would anyone even prove it? Steve Hodel and a former LA County deputy DA who later reviewed the case both believed that line was about Elizabeth Short. There's more from that same recording, a muffled sound at one point that Steve interprets as a woman in distress inside the house, though the audio quality is genuinely bad enough that reasonable people disagree on what it actually captures. On its own, none of this is a smoking gun. A vague comment on a scratchy 1940s recording isn't a confession, but it was enough that at the time, investigators seriously considered George Hodel a real suspect before the case eventually went cold on everyone. And Steve doesn't stop at the wiretap. Over the following years, he digs into his father's whereabouts, his known associates, even his handwriting, comparing it to the mysterious notes the real killer allegedly sent to newspapers back in '47. He also starts connecting his father to other unsolved cases from that same era, women found in similarly staged, deliberate scenes. Steve's theory eventually grows to claim his father may be linked to several killings, not just one, earning him, in his own writing, a comparison to Jack the Ripper. He publishes his full case in a book in 2003, and it becomes a genuine phenomenon. Bestseller lists, documentaries, an actual retired homicide detective naming his own father as one of history's most notorious unsolved cases. Even a former LA County Deputy District Attorney publicly stated he found Steve's case convincing enough to believe George Hodel was likely responsible. And here's the part a lot of true crime content leaves out. Steve Hodel's theory has serious critics, including researchers who spent just as long studying this case as he has. Their pushback?
Almost everything in his case is circumstantial or interpretive: handwriting analysis that isn't universally accepted, an audio recording open to interpretation, family testimony that's disputed by other relatives who've publicly disagreed with Steve's version of events. Some point out that his father was one of dozens of men investigated at the time, and that plenty of circumstantial connections could be built around several other names on that same suspect list. No physical evidence, no DNA, no confirmed forensic link has ever tied George Hodel directly to Elizabeth Short's body. So where does that leave things? With a genuinely compelling theory from someone with real investigative credibility and just as many experts who think it's built on assumption, not proof. Officially, the LAPD has never closed this case, and no one has ever been formally charged. Steve Hodel passed away believing he'd solved it. His critics passed, and some are still active today, believing he never did. Maybe he was right. Maybe he just needed an answer badly enough to build one. Either way, on paper, in the actual case file, this is still unsolved.